The bullet had missed her by inches, close enough that Sarah Winslow could still hear the whistle of it cutting through the dry Colorado air as she pressed herself flat against the rocky outcropping. It was June of 1878, and she had been traveling alone through the San Juan Mountains for 3 days now, carrying nothing but a leather satchel, her father's old Winchester rifle, and a determination that most people back in Santa Fe had called either brave or foolish. The narrow mountain pass she had chosen was known locally as Devil's Spine, a treacherous route that even experienced prospectors avoided when they could. Bandits favored it, using the high rocks and twisted turns to ambush travelers foolish enough to venture through without protection. Sarah had known the risks when she started, but her choices had been limited after receiving word that her sister lay dying in Durango, Colorado, and there was no time to wait for a wagon train or proper escort. Another shot rang out, splintering the rock above her head and sending fragments of stone raining down on her dark hair. Her mare, a chestnut named Copper, whinnied nervously where Sarah had managed to secure her behind a cluster of boulders. The bandits had appeared without warning, 4 men on horseback who had materialized from behind a ridge like ghosts made solid. They had called out for her to stop, their intentions clear in their leering voices and the casual way they had drawn their weapons. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped her rifle, trying to remember everything her father had taught her before he died. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher with steady hands when holding chalk but far less confidence when it came to firing at living targets. The men were closing in now, their horses picking careful paths down the rocky slope, and she knew she could not hold them off forever. Then she heard it, the thunder of hooves approaching fast from the direction she had been heading. For a moment, her heart sank, thinking more bandits had arrived, but the shots that cracked through the air were not aimed at her. One of the men who had been pursuing her let out a yelp of pain and clutched his shoulder, nearly toppling from his saddle. His companions wheeled their horses around, suddenly more interested in this new threat than in the lone woman they had been hunting. The rider who emerged from around the bend sat tall in his saddle, a Winchester repeating rifle braced against his shoulder as he fired with the kind of practiced ease that spoke of years in dangerous country. He was broad-shouldered and lean, dressed in the practical clothes of a working cowboy. Worn denim, a blue cotton shirt faded from sun and washing, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a powerful buckskin gelding, responded to his commands with the seamless precision of a well-trained partner. "Get out of here unless you want to join your friend in bleeding," the cowboy called out, his voice carrying authority despite not being raised to a shout. He had already levered another round into his rifle's chamber, the weapon trained steadily on the remaining 3 bandits. The men hesitated, clearly weighing their options. The wounded one was cursing and trying to stem the blood flowing from his shoulder. Their leader, a scarred man with a dirty beard, spat into the dust and glared at the newcomer with pure hatred. "This is none of your concern, stranger. The woman's got something we want. She's got her life and her property, and they're staying with her," the cowboy replied. His tone had gone cold as winter ice. "You've got about 3 seconds to decide whether you want to ride away or get buried in this pass. I'm fine either way, but I suspect you boys might have a preference." For a long moment, everything hung in balance. Sarah held her breath, her finger resting against her rifle's trigger, ready to fire if the situation turned worse. She could see the tension in the cowboy's shoulders, the way his horse sensed his alertness and stood perfectly still, waiting. The scarred leader broke first. He jerked his head toward his men and yanked his horse's reins, turning the animal back up the slope. "You just made an enemy, cowboy. Remember that next time you ride through here." "I'll be sure to lose sleep over it," the cowboy called back, keeping his rifle trained on them until they had disappeared over the ridge. Even then, he did not lower the weapon immediately, his eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of an ambush. Sarah slowly stood up from behind her cover, her legs shaking more than she wanted to admit. The cowboy finally turned his attention to her, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a gray-green that seemed to take in everything without giving much away. A few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and a thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, the kind of mark that came from a knife or a very close call with something sharp. "You hurt?" he asked, dismounting with an easy grace and approaching her with his rifle now held loosely at his side. "No, I'm fine, shaken but fine." Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "You arrived just in time. Another few minutes and I don't think I could have held them off." He nodded, his expression serious. "This is a bad stretch of country to be traveling alone, madam." Those men were the Harding gang, or what's left of it. They've been working this pass for months, and the law has not managed to catch up with them yet. "I did not have much choice," Sarah said, brushing dust from her dark green traveling dress. "My sister is in Durango, and she is very ill. I received word a week ago that she might not have much time left. Every stage and wagon train I found was either full or not leaving soon enough." The cowboy's expression softened slightly. "That's rough luck. Still, you nearly paid a high price for it." He glanced back toward where the bandits had disappeared. "They might come back with more men, especially once that leader gets his pride back. This pass runs another 15 miles before it opens up near the Animas River Valley. You should not try to make it alone." "I don't suppose you're heading to Durango?" Sarah asked, even though she knew it was forward of her to ask such a thing of a stranger. Proper ladies did not request escorts from men they had just met, but proper ladies also did not usually find themselves pinned down by bandits in remote mountain passes. He studied her for a moment, those creek water eyes taking in her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "As it happens, I am. Got business with a ranch owner outside of town. Name's Thomas Irving." "Sarah Winslow," she replied, extending her hand before she could think better of it. He took it, his grip firm and calloused from years of hard work, and she felt an unexpected jolt of something she could not quite name run up her arm at the contact. "Well, Miss Winslow, I'd say we should get moving while we still have daylight. Those men might be gone, but there are plenty of other hazards in these mountains, and I'd rather not meet any of them in the dark." They mounted up, Thomas helping her check Copper's saddle and tack with the thorough attention of someone who understood that a single loose strap could mean disaster in rough country. As they rode, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. He sat his horse with the unconscious ease of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, his body moving in rhythm with his buckskin's gait. He kept his rifle across his saddle, ready but not anxious, and his eyes constantly swept the terrain around them, reading the land the way Sarah read books. "You know this country well," she observed after they had ridden in silence for nearly an hour. "Well enough," Thomas replied. "I've been working ranches in Colorado and New Mexico for about 7 years now. Started when I was 18, after my parents died of fever back in Missouri. Did not see much point in staying where everything reminded me of what I'd lost." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "I lost my father 2 years ago. My mother passed when I was young. It's just been my sister and me since then." He glanced at her, and something in his expression told her he understood that particular kind of loneliness. "What's her name? Your sister?" "Margaret." She married a man named Daniel Cartwright and moved to Durango last year to help him start a freight business. The last letter I received from her said she had caught pneumonia and it had settled deep in her lungs. Sarah's voice caught slightly. Daniel wrote that the doctor did not expect her to survive more than a few weeks. Durango's got a good doctor, Doc Brennan. If anyone can help her, he can. Thomas guided his horse around a fallen log that blocked part of the narrow trail. How long have you been on the road? I left Santa Fe 8 days ago. I took the stage as far as Pagosa Springs, but there was nothing heading west from there, so I bought copper and decided to make the journey myself. She patted her mare's neck affectionately. I taught school in Santa Fe, so I had some savings. Not much, but enough for a horse and supplies. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice held a note of respect. That took courage. Most women would not have attempted it. Most women probably have more sense than I do, Sarah replied with a slight smile. But Margaret is all the family I have left. I could not just sit in Santa Fe knowing she needed me. They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow where a spring bubbled up from between the rocks, providing fresh water for themselves and their horses. Thomas proved to be efficient at camp tasks, building a small fire with practiced economy, and setting coffee to boil in a battered tin pot he produced from his saddlebags. Sarah contributed cornbread from her supplies and some dried beef, and they ate while watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Tell me about the ranch where you work," Sarah said, wrapping her hands around her tin cup of coffee for warmth. The mountain air had turned cold with the sunset, and she had pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. "I don't work for a ranch right now," Thomas admitted. "I've been moving between jobs for the past few months, taking temporary work where I can find it. The business in Durango is about a permanent position with a man named Samuel Thornton. He runs cattle in the valley south of town and needs an experienced foreman. If things work out, it could be steady work for the first time in a while. You don't like staying in one place?" Sarah asked, curious about this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. Thomas considered the question, staring into the fire as he gathered his thoughts. "It's not that I don't like it. It's more that I have not found a place worth staying for yet. Most ranch owners see their hands as replaceable parts, like horseshoes or rope. You work until you're used up, then they bring in someone younger and stronger. I've been looking for something different, a place where a man's work means something, and where there might be a future beyond the next season's roundup." There was a wistfulness in his voice that touched something in Sarah's heart. She understood the feeling of searching for a place to belong, that sense of being adrift in a vast country that offered both opportunity and loneliness in equal measure. "I hope you find it," she said quietly. "Everyone deserves a home." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold air. There was something in his gaze that made her acutely aware of how alone they were out here, just the two of them and the vast wilderness stretching in all directions. But it was not fear she felt. It was something else entirely, something that both excited and frightened her. "You should get some sleep," Thomas said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "I'll take first watch, make sure those bandits don't get any ideas about tracking us." Sarah wanted to protest, to say that she could share the watch, but exhaustion from days of hard traveling suddenly crashed over her like a wave. She nodded and spread her bedroll near the fire, using her saddle as a pillow in the way Thomas had shown her. As she drifted toward sleep, her last clear image was of him sitting cross-legged by the fire, his rifle across his knees, silhouetted against the stars like some figure from the old stories her father used to tell. She woke once in the deep hours of night to find him still awake, still watching, and felt a strange sense of safety that she had not experienced since her father died. This man, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, had appointed himself her protector without asking for anything in return. In a land where most people looked out only for themselves, it was a rare and precious thing. Morning came with frost on the ground and their breath misting in the cold air. Thomas had coffee ready before Sarah had fully emerged from her blankets, and she accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her stiff fingers around its warmth. "We should make Durango by late afternoon if we keep a steady pace," Thomas said as they broke camp. "The trail gets easier from here, and once we clear the pass, it's mostly open valley riding." The day proved him right. The narrow, treacherous path gradually widened into a more established trail, and by mid-morning they had emerged from the mountains into the broad valley, where the Animas River wound its way south. The landscape opened up around them, revealing distant peaks still capped with snow and grasslands that would be green in another few weeks. Cattle dotted the ranges, and they passed several ranch buildings set back from the road. As they rode, Sarah and Thomas talked more easily than they had the day before. He told her about his years working ranches, the hard lessons learned, and the good men and bad he had worked alongside. She spoke of teaching school, of the children she had educated, and the satisfaction of watching young minds grasp new concepts. They discovered they were both readers, a relative rarity in the frontier territories, and spent a pleasant hour discussing the novels they had managed to acquire over the years. "I have not met many cowboys who read Shakespeare," Sarah observed with a smile. Thomas grinned, the expression transforming his serious face into something younger and more carefree. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure I could read before I could properly ride, which is saying something since my father had me on a horse before I could walk. She always said that a man who could not read was a man who would never truly be free, because he would always be at the mercy of those who could." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Thomas agreed, his smile fading into something more wistful. "I wish you could have met her. I think you two would have gotten along." There was something in the way he said it, a gentleness and a hint of something deeper, that made Sarah's heart skip. She told herself not to read too much into it, that he was simply being kind, but she could not quite silence the small voice in her head that whispered other possibilities. Durango appeared in the distance just after 2 in the afternoon. A sprawling collection of buildings nestled in the valley with the river running along its eastern edge. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and Sarah could see the distinctive shape of the new railroad depot that had been built the year before. The town had grown considerably since the Denver and Rio Grande Railway had arrived, transforming it from a rough mining settlement into a more permanent community. "Where does your sister live?" Thomas asked as they approached the outskirts of town. "The last address I have is on 3rd Avenue, near the freight office." Sarah's anxiety had been building with each mile, worry about what she might find when she reached Margaret's home making her stomach tight. "I know where that is. I'll take you there directly." They rode through the busy streets, passing freight wagons and pedestrians going about their business. Durango thrummed with afternoon activity. Hammers rang from a construction site, a dog barked somewhere nearby, and the smell of bread baking drifted from a bakery. Thomas guided them expertly through the traffic until they reached a modest wooden house painted white with green shutters. A small garden, still mostly bare from winter, occupied the front yard. Sarah dismounted on legs that felt suddenly weak. This was the moment she had been dreading and desperate for in equal measure. Thomas dismounted as well, and without being asked, He took Copper's reins along with his own horses. "I'll wait here with the horses," he said quietly. "Take whatever time you need." Sarah wanted to thank him, wanted to say something adequate to express her gratitude for everything he had done, but words felt insufficient. Instead, she simply nodded and walked toward the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. She knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a man in his early 30s with rumpled hair and exhausted eyes. He stared at her for a moment before recognition dawned. "Sarah, thank God. I was not sure my letter would reach you in time. Daniel." She embraced her brother-in-law briefly. "How is she?" His expression was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "Not good. The doctor has done what he can, but the pneumonia has taken a heavy toll. She's been asking for you." He stepped aside to let her enter. "She's in the bedroom. Go on in." "I'll be right here if you need anything." Sarah moved through the small house with her heart in her throat. The bedroom door was partially open, and she pushed it wider to see her sister lying in bed, propped up on pillows. Margaret had always been the prettier of the two sisters, with lighter hair and delicate features, but illness had transformed her into a pale shadow. Her breathing came in labored rasps, and her eyes were closed. "Margaret," Sarah whispered, moving to sit in the chair beside the bed. "It's me." "It's Sarah." Her sister's eyes fluttered open, and despite her obvious pain, a smile touched her lips. "You came. I was so afraid you would not get here in time." "Of course I came. Nothing could have kept me away." Sarah took her sister's hand, alarmed by how hot and dry it felt. "We're going to get you better. I'm here now, and I'll take care of you." Margaret's smile turned sad. Sweet Sarah, always trying to fix everything, but some things cannot be fixed with determination and hard work. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound that made Sarah's chest ache in sympathy. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't spend your life alone. I know you loved Father and you dedicated yourself to taking care of him after Mother died, and then you threw yourself into teaching. But you deserve more than that. Promise me you'll let yourself live, let yourself love someone. Margaret, please, don't talk like this. You're going to recover." But even as Sarah said the words, she knew they were not true. She could see death in her sister's labored breathing, in the unnatural flush of her cheeks, in the way her body seemed to be consuming itself from within. They talked for hours as the afternoon faded into evening. Margaret spoke of her life with Daniel, the happiness they had shared in their brief marriage, and her regrets about the future they would never have. Sarah listened and held her sister's hand, and tried not to let her tears fall where Margaret could see them. It was near midnight when Margaret's breathing changed, becoming even more labored and irregular. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with grief, and came to stand on the other side of the bed. He took his wife's other hand, and the three of them sat in silence as Margaret's life slowly ebbed away. She died just before dawn, slipping away so quietly that for a moment Sarah was not sure she had gone. Then Daniel let out a choked sob, and the reality of it crashed over Sarah like a physical blow. Her sister, her only remaining family, was gone. The next days passed in a blur of arrangements and rituals. The funeral was held on a bright spring morning that felt cruelly beautiful given the circumstances. Half the town seemed to turn out, testimony to the friendships Margaret and Daniel had formed in their short time in Durango. Sarah stood beside her brother-in-law at the graveside and listened to the minister's words without really hearing them, her mind numb with grief. Through it all, Thomas was there. He had found a room at one of Durango's boarding houses, but appeared each morning to help with whatever needed doing. He arranged for the horses to be stabled, dealt with the funeral home, and performed a dozen other small tasks that Sarah was too overwhelmed to manage. He never imposed himself, never asked for recognition, simply did what needed doing and then faded into the background. After the funeral, back at the house, Daniel pulled Sarah aside. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked as though he had aged 10 years in the past few days. "I cannot stay here," he said quietly. "Everything in this house reminds me of her. I have a brother in California who has been asking me to join him in business out there. I think I'm going to sell the freight company and go west." "I understand," Sarah replied, and she did. She could see the ghost of her sister in every corner of this house, in every possession and small detail. Staying here would be torture for Daniel. "The thing is," Daniel continued, "Margaret told me about some money our parents left her. It was not much, but she never spent it, kept it put away for an emergency that never came. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure you got it. It's yours by right anyway, as her only sibling." He pressed an envelope into Sarah's hands. Inside was more money than she had seen in one place in years, enough to live on for months or even longer if she was careful. "Daniel, I cannot take this." "You must. Margaret made me swear, and I'm not going to break a deathbed promise to my wife." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Besides, you came all this way to be with her. You gave up your position in Santa Fe, your home. The least I can do is make sure you have something to start over with." They held each other for a moment, two people united in grief, and then Daniel pulled away and wiped his eyes. "That cowboy, Thomas Irving, he's a good man. Margaret mentioned him before she died, said she was glad you had found someone to watch over you on the road. He's been very kind," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to read too much into her brother-in-law's words. "Be kinder to yourself, Sarah. Let someone take care of you for once. You've spent so long taking care of everyone else." Daniel managed a weak smile. "Margaret would have wanted that for you." Thomas appeared at the house the next morning to find Sarah sitting on the front porch, staring at nothing in particular. He sat down beside her without speaking, and they remained in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I met with Samuel Thornton yesterday," Thomas finally said. "Took the position as his foreman. It's good work, fair pay, and he seems like a decent man to work for." "I'm glad," Sarah replied, meaning it. "You deserve some stability. What about you? What are your plans?" It was the question Sarah had been avoiding thinking about. "I don't know. I suppose I should return to Santa Fe, try to get my teaching position back, but the thought of making that journey again." She trailed off, unable to articulate the exhaustion that filled her at the mere idea. "You could stay in Durango," Thomas suggested quietly. "The town is growing. They will need teachers, especially with more families moving in now that the railroad is here. I suppose I could inquire about positions." Sarah looked at him, at this man who had become such an unexpected constant in her life over the past week. "Would you mind if I stayed?" Something flickered in his creek water eyes, something warm and hopeful. "I'd like it very much if you stayed." The moment stretched between them, filled with things neither quite dared to say. Then Thomas stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, let me show you the ranch. It might do you good to get out of town for a few hours." Sarah took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "I'd like that." They rode south out of Durango, following the river valley into cattle country. The Thornton Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of good grazing land, with the main house and outbuildings situated on a rise that offered views in all directions. Thomas introduced her to Samuel Thornton, a weathered man in his 50s with a quick smile and a firm handshake, and his wife Ruth, a plump woman who insisted Sarah stay for lunch. Over roast chicken and fresh bread, Ruth Thornton proved to be a wealth of information about Durango's social landscape. She confirmed that the town was indeed looking for a new teacher, as the previous one had married and moved away with her husband. "You should speak to Mayor Harrison," Ruth said, passing Sarah more potatoes. "He's on the school board. I could introduce you if you'd like. We're hosting a gathering here next week, just a small social evening. You should come. I wouldn't want to impose, especially during my mourning period." "Nonsense," Ruth replied firmly. "Margaret was a friend of mine, and I know she would not have wanted you sitting alone in grief. Besides, mourning does not mean cutting yourself off from the living. Come to the gathering, meet some people, and we will make sure you get introduced to the right folks about the teaching position." Sarah found herself agreeing, partly because Ruth Thornton was the kind of woman who was difficult to refuse, but also because the idea of having a purpose again, of doing something meaningful, appealed to her grief-clouded mind. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to rebuild her life in Durango. She met with Mayor Harrison and was offered the teaching position, which she accepted. Daniel sold the house and freight business and left for California, pressing Sarah to write to him and keep in touch. Sarah rented a small room above the general store, modest but clean and affordable, and began preparing for the fall term when school would resume. Through all of it, Thomas was a constant presence. He would ride into town on Sundays, his one day off from the ranch, and they would walk together or share meals at the hotel restaurant. They talked about everything and nothing: books they had read, places they had been, dreams they harbored for the future. Sarah found herself looking forward to those Sundays with an intensity that surprised her, counting the days until she would see him again. One warm evening in early July, Thomas arrived in town and suggested they ride out to a spot he had discovered along the river. Sarah agreed, and they made their way to a bend in the Animas where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water ran clear and cool over smooth stones. They dismounted and sat on the riverbank, watching the water flow past. Thomas had been quieter than usual during the ride, and Sarah could sense something weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking about what you said that first night we camped together," he finally said, not looking at her. "About everyone deserving a home. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually." "And?" Sarah prompted gently when he did not continue. "And I realized that home is not just a place. It's people. It's the connections we make and the relationships we build." He turned to face her then, and the intensity in his eyes made Sarah's breath catch. "I've been moving from place to place for 7 years, always looking for somewhere to belong, but I never found it because I was looking for the wrong thing." "What were you looking for?" "A destination. An end point. Somewhere I could stop and say, this is it, this is home." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "But home is not a destination. It's a journey you take with someone who matters to you." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Thomas, I know it has not been long. I know you're still grieving your sister, and that this might not be the right time. But I need you to know that from the moment I saw you in that mountain pass, refusing to give up even when you were outgunned and scared, I have not been able to stop thinking about you." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "You're brave and kind and smart, and when I think about my future now, I can't imagine it without you in it." "I feel the same way," Sarah whispered, hardly daring to believe this was happening. "I've been trying not to admit it to myself because it seemed too soon, too fast, but I cannot imagine going back to the way things were before I met you." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then don't go back. Move forward with me instead. I'm not a rich man, and I cannot offer you much beyond hard work and honest affection, but what I can offer, I offer freely." "That's all I've ever wanted," Sarah replied, and then Thomas was kissing her, really kissing her, and the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them and the sound of the river running past. They were married in September, on a golden afternoon when the aspens on the mountainsides had turned to flame. It was a simple ceremony held at the church in Durango, with Ruth and Samuel Thornton standing as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Sarah wore a blue dress that Ruth had helped her make, and Thomas wore his best suit, looking almost uncomfortable in clothing that did not include denim and leather. Samuel Thornton had offered them the use of a small cabin on the ranch property, a foreman's house that had stood empty for years. It needed work, but it was sound and private, and Sarah had fallen in love with it immediately. They spent their first weeks of marriage fixing it up together, patching the roof, replacing broken windows, and painting the walls. Thomas built furniture in the evenings after his ranch work was done. A table, chairs, a bed frame that he carved with surprising delicacy. Sarah began teaching when the fall term started and found joy in working with the children of Durango. Her students ranged from 6 to 14, farm kids and town kids mixed together, all hungry for education. She taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and watched them grow and learn with the same satisfaction she had felt in Santa Fe. Their life developed a comfortable rhythm. Thomas would be up before dawn to start his work on the ranch, and Sarah would prepare breakfast before walking the 2 miles into town for school. She would return in the late afternoon to find Thomas already working on some improvement to their home or tending the small garden they had planted. They would make dinner together, eat by lamplight, and then sit on their porch watching the stars emerge while Thomas told her about his day, and she shared stories from the schoolroom. It was not an easy life. Thomas worked long hours in all weather, and there were weeks when Sarah barely saw him during roundup season. Money was tight and luxuries were few, but it was a good life, built on mutual respect and growing love, and Sarah had never been happier. Their first winter together brought heavy snows that sometimes kept Sarah from making it to town for school. On those days, she would work on lesson plans while Thomas repaired tack or worked on his wood carving, a hobby he had developed to pass the long winter evenings. They learned each other's habits and moods, the small intimacies of married life that bound them closer together. In early spring, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after dinner, watching his face transform from surprise to pure joy. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "As sure as I can be. I've missed 2 courses now and I've been sick most mornings." Sarah covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Thomas replied, pulling her into his arms. "A baby." "Our baby. I cannot quite believe it." They prepared for the baby's arrival with the same methodical care they brought to everything. Thomas built a cradle from wood he had been saving for something special, carving it with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, working by lamplight in the evenings. Ruth Thornton proved to be an invaluable source of advice, having raised 4 children of her own, and Sarah found herself grateful for the older woman's friendship. Their son was born in November of 1879, a few weeks before Thanksgiving. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she might not survive it, but Dr. Brennan proved as capable as his reputation suggested. When Thomas was finally allowed into the room to meet his son, Sarah saw tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him William Thomas Irving after both of their fathers. He was a healthy baby with strong lungs and his father's gray-green eyes, and Sarah fell in love with him so completely and immediately. that it took her breath away. Motherhood changed Sarah in ways she had not anticipated. The fierce protectiveness she felt toward William was unlike anything she had experienced before, a love so intense it was almost frightening. She reduced her teaching hours for the first year, working only part-time so she could spend more time with her son, and Thomas arranged his schedule to be home as much as possible. Watching Thomas with William revealed new dimensions to her husband's character. He was patient and gentle, singing lullabies in a soft voice and walking the floor with their son during fussy nights. He changed diapers without complaint and bathed William with careful attention, his large, work-roughened hands surprisingly deft with the tiny baby. "My father was not around much when I was growing up," Thomas told Sarah one night as he rocked William to sleep. "He worked from dawn to dusk and then collapsed into bed. I barely knew him and then he was gone. I promised myself that if I ever had children, I would do better. I want William to know his father, to have memories of me that are about more than just absence." The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were dry summers that stressed the ranch and threatened Samuel Thornton's herd. There were hard winters when fuel was scarce, and every day was a battle against the cold. Thomas broke his leg during a roundup when his horse stumbled, and spent 6 frustrating weeks unable to work properly. Sarah suffered a miscarriage 2 years after William was born, a loss that grieved them both deeply. But there were also moments of profound joy. William's first steps, taken between his parents in the cabin's main room. The night Sarah was offered the position of head teacher for the expanding Durango school system. The spring when Thomas was made a full partner in the Thornton Ranch, Samuel having no sons of his own and wanting to ensure his legacy continued. The evening they sat on their porch and watched a meteor shower paint fire across the sky. In the fall of 1883, Sarah gave birth to their daughter, a tiny girl with dark hair and her mother's determined chin. They named her Margaret Ruth, honoring both Sarah's sister and the woman who had become like a mother to them both. William, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously. The cabin that had once seemed adequate now felt cramped with 2 children, so Thomas and Samuel drew up plans for an addition. Over the course of that winter and the following spring, they built 2 new rooms, a proper bedroom for William and a nursery for Margaret. Thomas insisted on carving details into the woodwork of each room, wanting his children to have beautiful spaces that showed how much they were loved. By 1885, Durango had transformed from a rough frontier town into a genuine community. The railroad brought regular traffic and commerce. New businesses opened regularly, and the population had tripled since Sarah first arrived. The school system had expanded to 3 buildings, and Sarah oversaw a staff of 5 teachers, shaping the education of dozens of children. Thomas thrived as well. His partnership in the Thornton Ranch gave him financial security and respect in the community. He served on the town council and helped organize annual cattle drives. The frightened, rootless young man who had ridden into Devil's Spine 7 years earlier had grown into a confident, established pillar of Durango society. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch watching William and Margaret play in the yard, Thomas took Sarah's hand. "Do you ever think about that day in the mountain pass?" he asked. "About how different things might have been if I had ridden a different route or arrived 10 minutes later?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. We found each other and that's what matters." I was heading to Durango for a job interview, nothing more. I had no expectations beyond that. And then I came around that bend and saw you, pressed against those rocks, refusing to surrender even though you were outnumbered and outgunned. He squeezed her hand gently. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I did not realize it at the time. I was terrified, Sarah said with a slight laugh. I had no idea what I was doing. I probably would have gotten myself killed if you had not shown up. But you would have gone down fighting. That was what struck me, your courage. Thomas pulled her closer, and she leaned against his shoulder. I had been searching for home for so long, traveling from place to place trying to find where I belonged. I never imagined that home would find me instead, in the form of a school teacher traveling alone through territory that grown men feared. Sarah watched their children playing, their laughter carrying on the evening air. William was showing Margaret how to catch fireflies, his patient instructions reminding her so much of his father. Margaret told me before she died to let myself live and love. I think she would have been happy to see how things turned out. I hope so, Thomas replied. I wish I could have known her better, could have thanked her for giving me the greatest gift of my life. You've given me a gift too, Sarah said softly. A home, a family, a life I never imagined I could have. I was so focused on duty and responsibility that I had forgotten how to dream. You taught me how to dream again. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief of losing her sister would never fully leave her, but it had been joined by so much joy that the balance had shifted. She had a husband who loved her, children who filled her days with purpose and delight, work that mattered, and a place in a community that had embraced her as one of their own. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new blessings. Samuel Thornton died in 1890, leaving the ranch entirely to Thomas and Ruth. They ran it together, Ruth managing the business side while Thomas handled the operations, and the ranch prospered under their partnership. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses, while Margaret proved to be a spirited child with an independent streak that both exasperated and delighted her parents. Sarah gave birth to 2 more children, another son named James in 1887, and a final daughter, Catherine, in 1890. Their cabin had to be expanded twice more to accommodate the growing family, and eventually became a sprawling house that bore little resemblance to the simple structure Thomas and Sarah had first occupied. In 1895, on a golden September afternoon much like the one on which they had married 16 years earlier, Thomas and Sarah stood together on their porch watching their 4 children play in the yard. William was 17 now, tall and serious, preparing to attend college in Denver. Margaret, at 12, was already showing signs of the beauty she would become. James, 8 years old, was wrestling with the family dog, and 6-year-old Catherine was picking wildflowers with intense concentration. 17 years, Thomas said, slipping his arm around Sarah's waist. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode into that mountain pass. Other times it feels like a whole lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago, Sarah replied, leaning into him. We were different people then, younger, less certain, still figuring out who we were and what we wanted. Do you have any regrets? Thomas asked. Sarah considered the question seriously, as she always did when Thomas asked her something important. I regret that Margaret never got to see this, to meet her nieces and nephews. I regret that my parents did not live to see me happy. But as for my life with you, she turned to face him fully, looking into those creek water eyes that still had the power to make her heart skip. Not a single regret, not one moment that I would change. Thomas kissed her then, a soft, lingering kiss that still held all the passion and promise of their first kiss by the river so many years ago. Their children made exaggerated gagging sounds, and they broke apart laughing. "Go help your sister with those flowers, William," Thomas called out. "And James, be gentle with that dog or you will be explaining to your mother why we need a new one." As their children obeyed, Sarah and Thomas settled into the porch swing Thomas had built the previous summer. The mountains rose in the distance, the same peaks that had witnessed their first meeting, and the evening air was soft with the promise of autumn. "I love you," Sarah said quietly. "I do not say it enough, but I love you more than I can express with words." "I know," Thomas replied. "You show me every day in 1,000 small ways, and I love you too, more with each passing year." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children and the sun slowly setting behind the mountains. The territory that had once seemed so dangerous, so unknown, had become home. The journey that had begun with fear and desperation had led to a life richer than either of them could have imagined. Sarah thought about the young woman she had been, traveling alone through Devil's Spine with nothing but determination and terror driving her forward. She thought about Thomas, the lonely cowboy who had been searching for a place to belong. Two people, both lost in their own ways, who had found each other in the middle of nowhere and built something lasting and true. The Wild West was changing. Electricity was coming to some towns, automobiles were beginning to appear on eastern streets, and the frontier was slowly being tamed. But here, in their little corner of Colorado, some things remained constant: the mountains, the river, the vast sky, and the love that bound their family together. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Sarah and Thomas herded their children inside for dinner. The house filled with warmth and noise, with laughter and the comfortable chaos of a large family. They gathered around the table Thomas had built with his own hands, bowed their heads for grace, and shared a meal together. This was home. Not the place, though the house and land were dear to them, but the people gathered around this table. The husband who had ridden to her rescue and stayed at her side ever since. The children who carried both their legacies forward into an uncertain future. The life they had built together from nothing but courage and hope. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had grown quiet, Thomas and Sarah stood together at their bedroom window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Do you ever wonder what adventures tomorrow will bring?" Thomas asked. Sarah smiled and took his hand. "Every day. But whatever comes, we'll face it together just like we have from the beginning." "Together," Thomas agreed, pulling her close. "Always together." And as they held each other in the darkness, with their children sleeping safely under their roof and the mountains standing guard over the valley, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey that had begun in fear through dangerous territory had led her home, not to a place, but to a person, and to a love that would endure as long as the mountains themselves. The story of the schoolteacher who had traveled alone through territory men feared, and the cowboy who had ridden beside her until she was safe, had become something more, something neither of them could have predicted. It had become a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of courage, faith, and the bonds that tie two souls together across time and distance. And in the years to come, when their children told their own children about how their grandparents met, they would speak of destiny and fate, of a chance encounter that changed everything. But Thomas and Sarah knew the truth. There was no destiny, no fate, only two people who had chosen each other in a moment of crisis and then chosen each other again every day after, building a life together one choice at a time. That was the real story. Not the dramatic rescue or the dangerous journey, but the quiet, steady accumulation of shared days and nights, of challenges faced and joys celebrated, of a love that deepened and matured like fine wine, growing richer with each passing year. As Sarah drifted toward sleep that night, safe in her husband's arms, her last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. For the sister whose dying wish had been for Sarah to find love. For the bandits whose attack had brought Thomas into her life. For every twist of fate that had led her to this moment, this place, this man. She had been traveling alone through territory men feared, but she had not finished that journey alone. Thomas had ridden beside her, and he had never stopped riding beside her through all the years and all the challenges that followed. He had kept his unspoken promise from that first day, to see her safely home. And home, they had discovered together, was wherever they were, as long as they were together.